A jeweler's loop with my mother's initials engraved into the brass sits in my coat pocket on the night I finally understood exactly what I was looking at. My name is Imogen Vale. I'm 34 years old. And on the second Saturday of October, at my father's birthday dinner, his new wife wore my dead mother's sapphire necklace, the one 4 generations of Fairhaven women had worn before her. And she touched it all through dinner the way you touch something you're proud of, not something you're borrowing. I waited until dessert. Then I slid my phone across the white tablecloth, opened to a single photograph, and turned it so only she could see it clearly. Her face went the color of the good china. What none of the 11 other people at that table understood, not my father, not the family friends he'd invited to celebrate, was that the photograph on my screen wasn't a threat. It was 3 years old, it was from a city none of us had ever lived in, and it proved something about the woman sitting at the head of my mother's dining table that was about to end her marriage before the cake was even cut. Welcome back to Echoes from Grandma's Room, where the quiet ones finally get to finish their sentence. If you've ever had to prove the truth with something colder and more exact than anger, this one is for you. Comment the word loop if you've ever had to look closer at something everyone else took at face value. And subscribe, because you are going to want to see exactly what was in that photograph. I need to take you back to a Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago, standing in my mother's sitting room on Jones Street in Savannah, watching her hold a jeweler's loop to her right eye and turn a garnet ring slowly under the lamp. Because that afternoon is the reason I understood, before I ever understood anything else about that necklace, exactly what I was looking at when it finally mattered. My mother, Colette Fairhaven Vale, was not a professional jeweler. She never sat for a certification exam or worked behind a counter, though I've always suspected she could have passed one cold without a single hour of formal study, purely on instinct sharpened by a lifetime of handling her own family's collection. She was something rarer, and I've come to believe more valuable. A woman who had grown up inside a family that measured its own history in stones, the Fairhavens of Charleston and later Savannah. 4 generations deep in an heirloom collection that had survived 2 wars, 1 bankruptcy, and more family funerals than anyone wanted to count. My mother could read a stone the way some people read weather, and she taught me everything she knew across a decade of Tuesday afternoons, starting when I was 19 and bored home from college for the summer, ending only when the cancer took the steadiness out of her hands 4 years ago, 2 months before I turned 30. The last real lesson she ever gave me, sitting in that same sitting room with a blanket over her knees even in July, was the sentence I have built my entire adult life around without ever fully realizing it until this past October. Her hands had already started to shake by then, the chemotherapy having taken the fine motor precision she'd once been so proud of, and I remember she laughed softly at herself, setting down the garnet ring she'd been trying to examine, saying that her eyes still worked even when her hands no longer wanted to cooperate. She reached instead for the loop, held it steady between 2 fingers, and told me the last thing she ever taught me on purpose. "A gem never lies about what it is, Imogen," she said, turning the loop over in her thin fingers before she pressed it into mine. "Only people do that?" I didn't know yet, that afternoon, how literally I would need to hold onto that sentence someday. I became a certified gemologist through the Gemological Institute of America 2 years after my mother died, sitting for the same graduate-level diamond and colored stones examinations she had once considered taking herself, decades earlier, before marriage and motherhood rearranged her own plans. I now work as an independent appraiser here in Savannah, mostly estate work, insurance documentation, the occasional auction house consultation when something interesting comes through the historic district. It's quiet work, careful work. The kind of work where you learn, the way my mother learned it from her own mother before her, that the difference between a genuine 4-carat Ceylon sapphire and an extremely convincing substitute can come down to a fraction of a millimeter in the girdle facet, a detail almost nobody in the world is trained to notice. And almost everybody, if you've ever had a skill passed down to you so quietly you didn't realize it was training you for something specific until years later, comment the word inherited, because that's exactly what happened to me, and I promise you, it's about to matter more than you'd expect. And subscribe, because the piece of jewelry at the center of this story is the same piece my mother handed me, quite literally, the last time she was well enough to stand. The Fairhaven necklace is the single most valuable object my family has ever owned, and I want to describe it properly, because its exact details are the entire hinge this story turns on. Commissioned in 1911 by my great-great-grandmother's husband from Prewitt and Klein, a jeweler on Broad Street in Charleston that closed its doors sometime in the 1960s. It holds a rose-cut Ceylon sapphire at its center, just under 9 carats, surrounded by a graduated collar of old mine-cut diamonds set in platinum over gold. The kind of Edwardian craftsmanship nobody produces anymore because it isn't cost-effective to produce it that way. Inside the clasp, nearly invisible unless you know to look, is a tiny stamped hallmark. The letters P and K nested inside a small diamond shape, Prewitt and Klein's maker's mark, along with a hand-scratched inventory number 1147 that I know by heart the way some people know a phone number from childhood. I know all of this with total documented precision because 4 years ago, as the executor named in my mother's will, I formally appraised the entire Fairhaven collection for estate purposes, the necklace included. I have the full report on file, complete with high-resolution photographs of the hallmark under magnification, the exact measurements of the center stone, a spectral analysis confirming the sapphire's natural, untreated origin, and a full condition report noting every scratch and setting quirk the piece had accumulated across 113 years of being worn to weddings, funerals, and everything in between. My mother wore that necklace to my parents' own wedding in 1988. She wore it to my college graduation. She was buried without it, at her own written instruction, because she wanted it to keep moving forward through the family rather than sitting still in the ground with her. My father, Emery Vale, 64 years old, spent 31 years building and eventually selling a mid-sized shipping logistics company out of the port here in Savannah, the kind of quiet old money success that never needed to announce itself. And after my mother died, he did what a lot of men his age and his particular kind of loneliness do. He grieved hard for about a year, and then, in a way that genuinely surprised everyone who knew him, he grieved less and less visibly. And by the second year, he had started going out again, dinners, gallery openings, the specific social circuit of a wealthy widower slowly being reintroduced to a city that had never stopped watching him. He met Vivienne Castellane at a charity gala for the Telfair Museum 18 months ago. She was 31 years old at the time, 32 by the time she became my stepmother, striking in the particular way that reads as effortless and almost never is, with a soft, cultivated accent that placed her, vaguely, somewhere between old Atlanta money and a finishing school neither of those cities actually has anymore. She told my father and later told all of us that she worked in art consulting, advising private collectors on acquisitions, a career that explained, conveniently, both her fine taste and her frequent, unspecified travel. If you've ever watched someone move into your family with a story that sounded exactly polished enough not to invite a single follow-up question, comment the word polished, because I've learned, the hard way, that stories built for comfort are often built that carefully on purpose. And subscribe because the first time I ever saw that necklace on Vivienne's neck was 7 months before my father's birthday dinner. And even then, standing across a crowded engagement party, something in me went quietly, professionally still. My father proposed to Vivienne 5 months after they met, a timeline that alarmed nearly everyone who loved him, including me, though I want to be honest and tell you that I said very little about it at the time, because grief makes a family cautious about which battles are actually worth having. Their engagement party was held at the house on Jones Street in March, the same sitting room where my mother once taught me to read, a stone now filled with caterers and rented uplighting. And it was there, watching Vivienne laugh with my father's old business partners, that I first saw her. I want to describe that room the way I remember it, because the details matter more than they seemed to at the time. The catering staff had moved my mother's own reading chair against the wall to make space for a champagne table, and someone had propped a framed engagement photograph of my father and Vivienne on the mantel, directly above the spot where my mother's collection of family photographs had sat for as long as I'd been alive, quietly relocated to a hallway shelf sometime that week without anyone thinking to mention it to me first. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I ever stepped fully into the room, taking in that mantle, and something in my chest did a slow, quiet fold, the specific grief of watching a house keep living without waiting for you to catch up. Small things, the kind of small things that don't mean anything on their own and mean everything stacked together, which is precisely the lesson my job has taught me to notice in every single piece I've ever examined. Vivienne wore a pale green dress that set off the sapphire beautifully, and she held court near the fireplace the entire evening with the specific, practiced ease of someone who has learned to be the center of a room without ever once seeming to try for it. My father's old business partner, a heavy-set man named Bertram Cole, told me at the bar that evening warmly that it did his heart good to see Emery smiling again. And I remember agreeing with him, genuinely, even as some small, trained part of me kept returning again and again to the necklace at her throat. If you've ever watched an entire room fall in love with a story before a single person, in it thought to ask a hard question about the person telling it, comment the word charmed, because I've come to believe that's exactly the atmosphere people like Denise Kowalski are trained to create, and it's very hard to see clearly from inside it. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because precision has become the discipline I trust most completely. It wasn't grief exactly, though grief was certainly present. It was the specific, professional itch of a trained eye catching on something before the conscious mind has caught up to why. I stood near the bar with a glass of champagne I never drank, watching the sapphire catch the light every time Vivienne turned her head. And something about the way it sat against her collarbone struck me as subtly, almost imperceptibly wrong. The clasp riding a half-inch higher than it should, the platinum collar sitting slightly differently against the skin than it had against my mother's for 36 years. I told myself, standing there with my untouched champagne, that I was imagining it, that grief and jealousy make excellent forgers of suspicion, that a woman wearing a dead woman's jewelry will always look wrong to the dead woman's daughter no matter how correct the piece actually is. I did not say anything that night. I want that honesty on the record, because it's the first of several moments in this story where I chose caution over accusation, and I still believe, looking back, that it was the right choice, even though it cost me 7 more months of watching that necklace travel further and further from where it belonged. If you've ever caught a wrongness in your own body before your mind could explain it, tell me in the comments how long it took you to trust that feeling enough to actually act on it, because mine took 7 months, and I want you to understand why. And subscribe, because before I ever found real proof, my own family made it very clear how unwelcome my suspicion actually was, and that pressure is exactly why I moved as carefully as I did. I want to be honest about the second thing I considered doing during those 7 months, because it matters as much as the first. Twice, at family dinners after the engagement, I came close to simply saying it out loud at the table. No evidence, no documentation, just the raw professional instinct that something about that clasp sat wrong against Vivienne's collarbone. Both times, I caught myself before the words left my mouth, because I had already watched, secondhand, what happened to the one person in my life who tried exactly that approach without proof to back it up. My Aunt Josephine, my father's older sister, said something close to it at Thanksgiving, 6 weeks into the engagement. A pointed comment about how quickly things were moving and how little any of us. My father did not simply brush it off. He grew genuinely cold toward her for nearly 2 months afterward, and the rest of the family, uncomfortable with the tension, quietly closed ranks around the idea that questioning his happiness was itself the real offense. I watched my father's oldest friend, a man named Porter who had known him since business school, tell me directly at a Christmas party that I needed to, in his words, let my father be happy, that grief makes daughters protective in ways that aren't always fair to the person doing the healing. I understood, watching that play out, that an accusation without proof would not simply fail. It would actively work against me, closing the exact doors I needed open to keep investigating quietly. That family pressure taught me something I carried through the rest of this story. The people who loved my father most were, without realizing it, the very reason Vivienne had so much room to operate undisturbed. Grief makes a family desperate for good news, and nobody wants to be the one who takes it away, which meant the burden of looking closely fell entirely on the one person willing to risk being wrong. The first real evidence I gathered came from a source I never expected, a Savannah goldsmith who had absolutely no idea what he'd actually helped set into motion. His name is Salvator Reyes. Everyone in the historic district calls him Sal, a third-generation goldsmith who runs a narrow shop on Whitaker Street with a workbench in the back window where you can watch him solder if you time your visit right. I've sent him restoration work for years, the kind of delicate prong repair and clasp servicing that requires hands steadier than mine have ever needed to be for my own work. 4 months before that birthday dinner on a slow Tuesday afternoon, I stopped by to pick up a repaired brooch, and Sal, in the easy way small shop owners make conversation, mentioned that he'd had the pleasure of servicing, quote, one of the Vale family's beautiful old pieces recently. A lovely young woman had brought it in. I asked him as evenly as I could manage, keeping my voice light the way you keep your voice light when your hands would rather be doing something else entirely, what exactly he'd done to it. Sal set down the brooch he was polishing and thought about it for a moment, the way craftsmen do when they're pulling a memory out of months of identical, careful work. He told me she'd asked for a full cleaning and a clasp adjustment, standard maintenance. Nothing unusual on its face except that she had also asked him, almost in passing, whether he could take detailed photographs of the piece from several angles for what she called insurance purposes. Close-ups of the setting, the hallmark, the stone's pavilion facets from underneath. Sal, seeing nothing strange in a reasonable insurance request, had happily obliged, and had even, at her request, emailed the full set of high-resolution photographs directly to an address she provided rather than handing over a memory card, which he mentioned only because it had struck him, mildly, as slightly more formal than most clients bothered with. She knew exactly what angles to ask for, he added, almost admiringly, still with no idea what he was actually telling me. Most folks don't think to ask for the underside shots at all. I want you to sit with that detail the way I sat with it in my car outside Sal's shop for almost 20 minutes afterward, because it is the exact moment this story stopped being a feeling and started being an investigation. Insurance appraisals do not require detailed underside photographs of a stone's pavilion facets. I know this because it is literally my job. The only reason anyone photographs a stone's pavilion facets in that kind of detail is to replicate it. If you've ever had an ordinary conversation accidentally hand you the first real thread of something much larger, comment the word thread, because that conversation with Sal is exactly where mine began. And subscribe, because what I found in my own family's bank records 3 weeks later is the part of this story where I stopped hoping I was wrong. I want to be completely honest with you about the first thing I considered doing, standing in Sal's doorway that afternoon, because I think the choice matters as much as anything else in this story. My first instinct was to drive straight to the house on Jones Street and confront Vivienne directly, that same evening, with nothing more than a gut feeling and a second hand. I actually got in my car and started the engine before I turned it back off. I have built an entire career on the principle that accusations without documentation are worse than useless. They're actively damaging, because they give a guilty person exactly the warning they need to cover their tracks before you've built a case strong enough to survive being disputed. I sat in that parking spot for a long time, and I decided, the same way I decide everything difficult, to gather proof first and feel my feelings later. As executor of my mother's estate, I still had limited, legally documented access to certain financial records tied to the family trust that held title to several of the Fairhaven pieces, including the necklace, records my father had never bothered to update or restrict access to since I'd handled the original estate appraisal. Going through the trust's safe deposit box log at the bank on Bull Street, a record that any cosigner or executor can request, I found something that made my stomach drop the same cold way it had at that engagement party 7 months earlier. Vivienne had been added as an authorized signer on that safe deposit box 2 months before the wedding, 3 months before that, and the access log showed a visit, alone, without my father present, 4 days after she was added. A full 20 minutes long, the kind of visit that makes sense if you're simply admiring family jewelry, and makes an entirely different kind of sense if you're documenting something you intend to have copied. Marisla Boone, our family's housekeeper of 20 years, mentioned something in passing around that same time that I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later. Folding laundry in the kitchen one afternoon while I sat at the counter going through appraisal paperwork, she told me almost offhandedly that Miss Vivienne had asked her, a few months back, exactly which day of the week Mr. Emery usually ran his errands downtown, and had seemed, Marisla said, a little too interested in the answer for it to have been simple small talk. Marisla had thought little of it at the time, the way you think little of most small oddities in a house you've worked in for 2 decades. But she told me she'd mentioned it once to my father directly, only to be told, gently, that she was imagining things, the same dismissal Aunt Josephine had received at Thanksgiving. I understood, hearing that Marisla had been quietly noticing exactly the same pattern I was, for months, with nobody in a position of authority willing to take her seriously either. I called Sal again that same week, this time asking directly, and he confirmed the timeline lined up almost exactly. Vivienne had brought the necklace in for cleaning roughly 6 weeks after that 20-minute bank visit. Plenty of time. He told me, unprompted, for a skilled bench jeweler somewhere to have already built a convincing cast from detailed photographs and precise measurements, ready to swap in whenever the opportunity presented itself. If you've ever traced a single strange detail backward and watched an entire timeline assemble itself against your will, comment the word timeline, because that's exactly the feeling of watching a bank log and a goldsmith's calendar agree with each other in a way you desperately wished they wouldn't. And subscribe, because the moment I finally held the real evidence in my own hands, comparing stone to stone under my mother's loupe, is the part of this story where suspicion became certainty. I engineered my way into a private moment with the necklace itself in late September, 3 weeks before that birthday dinner, at a family lunch where Vivienne had left the piece in a small velvet box on the hallway table while she changed clothes upstairs. The kind of careless comfort a person only has with something they've already decided belongs to them. I did not touch it recklessly. I photographed it exactly the way I would photograph any piece I was formally appraising, careful, methodical, documented, and I want to describe what I found, because it's the detail that turned 4 years of professional training into the single most important minute of my life. I remember my hands going very still the moment I understood what I was actually looking at. That specific stillness that comes right before your training takes over from your feelings, the same stillness I imagine surgeons must learn, or nurses on a bad shift. I photographed the clasp from 4 separate angles, checked it twice against the enlarged image on my phone from my own 4-year-old report, and set the necklace back into its velvet box exactly as I'd found it. Corner turned the same way, lid closed the same soft click, so that no one upstairs. The hallmark was wrong. Not absent, not obviously fake, wrong in the way only someone who has stared at the genuine mark under 10-power magnification for 4 solid years would ever catch. Prewitt and Klein's authentic maker's mark has a specific, minute asymmetry to the diamond shape surrounding the letters, a tiny manufacturing quirk from a hand-cut die that hasn't existed in over 60 years. A flaw so small it reads as intentional only if you already know precisely what you're looking for. The mark on the necklace in that velvet box was almost perfect. Almost. A modern laser-etched reproduction, expertly done, the kind of work that would fool 99 appraisers out of 100, and had in fact fooled every single person at that engagement party 7 months earlier, including, for one full evening, me. I also measured the center stone against my original documented figures, and it came back 0.18 millimeters smaller across the girdle, a difference invisible to the naked eye. Invisible to a jeweler's scale unless you already had the original numbers on file, which I did because 4 years earlier, grieving and careful, I had documented every single dimension of that stone for an estate report I never imagined I'd need for this. The real Fairhaven necklace, the one my mother wore for 36 years, was gone. What sat in that velvet box, what had been sitting on Vivienne's neck at every family gathering for 7 months, was an extraordinarily well-made copy. Good enough to fool a museum docent, good enough to fool my own father, not quite good enough to fool the one person on Earth who had measured the original down to 1/10 of a millimeter. If you've ever finally held physical, undeniable proof of something you'd suspected for months, comment the word proof, because I want you to know exactly what that moment feels like, cold and clarifying all at once, like a fever finally breaking. And subscribe, because the man I found at the center of this whole scheme, the one nobody in my family had ever thought twice about, is the reveal that turned this from a theft into something considerably larger. I brought everything I had to Roman Delacroix, the man who trained me, 68 years old now, technically retired but still keeping a small backroom office above an antique shop on Bull Street out of what he calls professional restlessness. Roman apprenticed under my mother's own family jeweler decades ago, and he has forgotten more about Southern estate jewelry than most working appraisers will ever learn. He listened to my entire account without interrupting once, the way he always has, and when I finished, he took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly on his shirt tail, a habit I'd watched him use for years as thinking time, and asked me the question that reframed everything. "What's the second thing you noticed, Imogen?" he said. "Not the first. Everyone remembers the first thing. I want the second." I told him about the 0.18 millimeter discrepancy, and he shook his head gently, the way he used to when I was still an apprentice missing the actual lesson inside a technical exercise. "No, the second thing you noticed was that you didn't say anything. Why?" I sat with that question longer than I wanted to, and I finally told him the truth, that I hadn't trusted my own eye enough yet to risk being wrong in front of my father. Roman nodded slowly. "That's the whole profession right there," he said. "Half of it is the loop. The other half is having the nerve to trust what the loop already told you." It wasn't gentle exactly, but it wasn't unkind either, and it's the sentence I carried with me through every difficult step that followed. He also gave me something more direct that same afternoon, less a question and more a flat, practical instruction, the kind he'd given me 100 times during my apprenticeship whenever I'd found something significant, but hadn't yet built the case strong enough to survive being disputed. "Don't bring your father a feeling," he said. "Bring him a file. Feelings get argued with, files don't." I built that file over the following weeks with his help, cross-referencing every document, every timestamp, every measurement, meeting him twice a week above that antique shop on Bull Street with fresh pages each time, until it was, in his own assessment, tight enough to survive. "Who brokered it, Imogen?" he said. "A copy this good doesn't come from a hobbyist, and a real salon sapphire this size doesn't just vanish into thin air. Somebody bought it. Somebody with the right buyers on speed dial." He was right, and I hadn't yet asked myself the question that mattered most, not what had been taken, but who had the network to move it. The answer arrived unexpectedly through my father's own guest list. A man named Julian Voss had been a fixture at nearly every family gathering since the engagement, introduced consistently as an old business associate of Vivienne's from her art consulting years. A soft-spoken man in his mid-40s who dealt, he'd mentioned more than once at dinner parties, in what he called private acquisitions, estate pieces, discreet buyers, the kind of vague professional description that, I now understood with the particular clarity of hindsight, described exactly the skill set required to move an 11-carat stolen sapphire through channels invisible to ordinary insurance databases and pawn registries alike. I spent 3 evenings that week doing the kind of quiet, methodical background work my job has trained me to do without ever raising suspicion, cross-referencing Julian's stated business, a small private consultancy called Meridian Fine Acquisitions, against every public filing I could find. The company existed, technically, registered in Delaware the way a great many companies that don't want close scrutiny tend to be, with a business address that turned out, when I looked it up on a mapping service, to be a mailbox rental storefront in a strip mall outside Jacksonville. No storefront, no staff listed anywhere, no client references beyond a handful of vague testimonials on a website that had clearly been built quickly and cheaply. Legitimate private dealers in estate jewelry, the kind Roman had introduced me to over the years, all carried verifiable histories, gallery affiliations, auction house relationships, professional memberships that could be checked with a single phone call. Julian Voss had none of that. He had instead a very good suit and an extremely convincing manner, which I was beginning to understand was the entire inventory of his actual profession. I called Roman again that same week describing what I'd found, and he told me something that stuck with me through everything that followed. "The best forgers I ever caught in 40 years weren't the ones who forged objects," he said. "They were the ones who forged relationships. An object only has to fool an eye for a few seconds. A relationship has to fool a whole family for months, sometimes years. That takes a very particular kind of patience, and it's never the patience of somebody with nothing to gain." Roman, once I described Julian in detail, went very quiet for a moment, and then told me something that connected the last piece I needed. He'd heard the name Voss before, tangentially, years earlier, in connection with a disputed estate piece out of New Orleans that had quietly disappeared from a probate inventory and never resurfaced through any legitimate auction house. A case that had gone nowhere because the family involved, grieving and embarrassed, had ultimately declined to pursue it publicly. If you've ever discovered that the harmless family friend at every dinner party was actually the missing piece of the entire puzzle, comment the word accomplice, because that particular chill deserves its own name. And subscribe because what I found searching New Orleans public records that same night is the photograph that would eventually go white across. I searched New Orleans newspaper archives and probate court filings that night at my kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, cross-referencing Julian Voss against every estate dispute filed in Orleans Parish across the previous 6 years. And on my fourth attempt, using a slightly different spelling, I found it. A society wedding announcement from a New Orleans paper, dated just over 3 years earlier, a photograph of a beaming older man, a shipping insurance executive named Foster Grantham, standing beside his new bride at their engagement party, a striking younger woman named Dahlia Renard, wearing, unmistakably, a distinctive emerald and diamond bracelet I recognized from a separate probate filing 18 months later, in which Foster Grantham's adult children had quietly petitioned the court regarding a missing heirloom bracelet following their father's sudden, contested divorce. The woman in that 3-year-old photograph, younger, dark-haired instead of Vivienne's honeyed blonde, name printed clearly as Dahlia Renard, had my stepmother's exact bone structure, her exact smile, the same small mole just beneath her left eye that no amount of careful lighting could fully disguise. Julian Voss appeared in a smaller photograph further down the same article, listed as a family friend and art consultant assisting the new couple with their collection, standing exactly where I'd have expected him to stand. Roman confirmed it independently the next morning, running Dahlia Renard against an older photograph database he still had access to from his decades in the appraisal world. And the match was, in his own words, not a resemblance, an identity. My stepmother had done this before. Not once, but at least twice that we could document, likely more that had simply never surfaced. Moving city to city, name to name, marrying grieving, lonely, wealthy widowers, patiently gaining trust and access, and quietly, methodically, replacing irreplaceable things with convincing enough substitutes that most families, too exhausted by grief to look closely at anything, would simply never notice at all. If you've ever traced one small lie backward far enough to find an entire hidden life built on repeating it, comment the word pattern because I promise you that discovery changes how carefully you look at everyone afterward. And subscribe because before I ever confronted anyone, Vivienne made her own move first, and it told me exactly how much she already suspected I knew. The second week of October, 4 days before that birthday dinner, Vivienne asked me to lunch, just the two of us, somewhere neutral her choice, a quiet cafe on Broughton Street with tables spaced generously apart. I want to be honest that I nearly declined, worried my face might betray more than I intended, but Roman had counseled me, the same steady way he'd counseled me through every step of this, that watching how a guilty person moves when they suspect discovery often tells you more than any document ever could. She was gracious, careful, genuinely skilled at the particular social choreography of appearing vulnerable without ever quite apologizing for anything specific. She told me she knew things had been strained between us, that she understood how hard it must be watching someone new wear her mother's things that she wanted more than anything, for us to find our way to something like peace before the wedding anniversary approaching in the spring. I watched her hands while she spoke, steady, unhurried, folded neatly on the table, the hands of a woman who had clearly rehearsed this exact tone in a mirror more than once. I know I can never replace her, she said at one point, softly, looking down at her coffee rather than at me, and I would never try to. I just want us to be able to sit at the same table without it feeling like a battle. It was, I have to admit, a genuinely well-constructed sentence, the kind designed to make the person hearing it feel cruel for doubting it. And then, sliding a small velvet box across the cafe table with the same careful precision I'd later use myself at that dinner, she told me she wanted me to have the necklace back. A gesture, she called it, of good faith, something she said she'd decided on her own, without my father's knowledge, because family, she said, quietly, meaningfully, matters more to her than any. I want you to understand exactly what she was offering me in that cafe, because it is the same trap this genre teaches you to recognize the moment it appears, dressed up in warmth instead of a courtroom. Accepting that box would have meant accepting the copy back, quietly, privately, with no admission of what had actually happened. No accounting for the real necklace already sold through Julian Voss's network. No acknowledgement of Foster Grantham's family in New Orleans who never got their answers either. It would have bought her exactly what every guilty person in this position wants most, a closed door instead of an open one. I told her as warmly as I could manage that I appreciated the gesture and that I needed a little more time to think about what peace actually looked like for our family. I did not take the box. I watched something small and calculating move behind her eyes when I didn't. The recalibration of a woman realizing her offer hadn't landed the way she'd planned. And I understood, driving home from that cafe, that I had exactly 4 days left before she found some other way to get ahead of what she now clearly feared was coming. If you've ever been offered a quiet, generous-sounding piece offering specifically designed to make you stop asking the one question that actually mattered, comment the word gesture. Because I promise you, the fastest way to spot a fake resolution is to notice how badly someone wants the door closed instead of opened. And subscribe because my father's 64th birthday dinner, and the photograph I finally let the whole table see, is the part of this story I still think about every single time I put a loop to my eye. The house on Jones Street was lit warmly for that Saturday dinner. 12 of us gathered around the same long mahogany table where my mother had hosted 40 years of holidays, my father's oldest business partners and their wives. Marisla Boone, our family's housekeeper of 20 years, moving quietly between the kitchen and the dining room the way she always had, Julian Voss seated 3 chairs down. Exactly where I now understood he'd always intended to be, close enough to watch, far enough to seem incidental. Vivienne wore the necklace, of course, the copy that had fooled every eye at that table except mine for 7 straight months, and she touched it throughout dinner the specific, satisfied way people touch something they believe has already been secured. I did not say a single word through the appetizer or the main course. I want that discipline on the record because it cost me more than anything else in this entire story. I passed the rolls. I complimented Marisla's shrimp and grits. I let my father toast his own birthday, misty-eyed and happy in a way I hadn't seen him in years, and some genuinely soft part of me almost let the whole evening pass untouched, almost let him have this one uncomplicated night before I handed him something that would break it wide open. Then dessert arrived, Marisla's chess pie, my mother's own recipe, and I understood, watching Vivienne's fingers trail once more across that false clasp, that letting one more night pass would only mean one more month, one more year, of watching my mother's family disappear piece by piece into a network built specifically to exploit exactly the kind of grief-softened trust my father had given her so freely. I took out my phone under the table, found the photograph I'd saved for exactly this moment, and slid it across the white tablecloth toward Vivienne, angled so only she could see the screen clearly at first. A New Orleans Society photograph, 3 years old, a beaming Foster Grantham, a dark-haired young woman named Dahlia Renard wearing another family's emerald bracelet, and beside her, unmistakably, Julian Voss. Her face went the exact color of the tablecloth beneath it. She didn't say anything at first, and in that silence my father, noticing the change in her before he noticed the phone, asked, gently, what was wrong. I turned the screen so the rest of the table could see it too, and I said, in the same level voice I used to deliver a formal appraisal, Dad, before we cut the cake, I think everyone should know whose necklace Vivienne is actually wearing tonight, and it isn't the one Mom wore for 36 years. If you've ever had to lay proof out in front of the exact people whose trust had been quietly, patiently exploited for months, comment the word revealed because that particular silence deserves to be named. And subscribe because what happened over the following 90 minutes, and what Julian Voss finally admitted once he understood exactly how much I already knew, is the part of this story that Julian recovered his composure faster than Vivienne did, the practiced smoothness of a man who has talked his way out of tighter rooms than this one. But my father, staring at that photograph, at the woman beside Foster Grantham who was unmistakably his own wife under a different name, went very quiet in a way I had genuinely never seen from him before. The specific stillness of a man watching an entire year of his life rearrange itself in real time. Bertram Cole, the same warm business partner who told me at that engagement party how good it did his heart to see my father happy again, set down his fork slowly and looked between the phone and Vivienne with an expression I can only describe as a man doing rapid, painful arithmetic on a friendship he genuinely believed was in good hands. His wife, seated beside him, reached over and took my father's hand without a word, the specific wordless comfort old friends offer when nothing they could say would actually help. Down the table, one of the other guests, a woman I barely knew from my father's charity board circle, whispered something to her husband that I couldn't quite catch, though I understood from the shape of her face exactly the kind of sentence it was. I laid out the rest of it plainly, methodically, the way I'd built the case for exactly this moment. The hallmark discrepancy, the 0.18 mm difference in the girdle facet, the unauthorized bank visit 2 months before the wedding, Sal's photographs sent to an unlisted email address. The New Orleans probate filing regarding Foster Grantham's missing emerald bracelet. The wedding announcement naming a woman called Dahlia Renard whose mole beneath her left eye, whose exact bone structure sat directly across the table from all of us, wearing a copy of my mother's necklace and calling herself Vivienne Castellane. Marisla, standing near the kitchen doorway with a coffee pot still in her hand, was the one who spoke into the silence that followed, quiet but clear enough to carry the length of that long table. "I told you something felt wrong about that safe deposit visit, Mr. Emery," she said, and I learned for the first time standing there that our own housekeeper had noticed the same unauthorized bank trip I'd found in the records and had mentioned it to my father months earlier, only to be gently waved off as imagining things. Vivienne tried briefly for the same soft, wounded deflection that had worked on her at that cafe 4 days earlier, insisting this was some misunderstanding, that the resemblance in the photograph was coincidental, that she'd never even been to New Orleans. Roman Delacroix, who I'd asked to attend that dinner specifically for exactly this possibility, sitting quietly near the end of the table until this precise moment, finally spoke, his voice carrying the calm, unhurried authority of 40 years spent testifying in exactly this kind of dispute. "I ran the identification myself, ma'am, against archived probate photography. It isn't a resemblance, it's a match." He set a folder on the table beside my phone, his own formal comparison report dated and signed. My father did not raise his voice. "I want you to understand that because I think it mattered more than shouting ever could have." He looked at Vivienne for a long moment, and then he asked her, quietly, the one question that finally cracked through whatever composure she had left. "Is there a real Foster Grantham, Vivienne, or whatever your name actually is?" She didn't answer him directly. She looked instead at Julian, and something passed between them, brief and unmistakable, the look of two people realizing at the exact same moment that whatever partnership had carried them through at least 2 prior marriages had just run out of road entirely. My father asked again, quieter this time, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Vivienne, look at me, is there a real Foster Grantham?" She finally looked at him, and whatever composure she'd built across 18 months seemed to slide off her all at once, her voice small in a way none of us had ever heard from her before. "It's more complicated than you think, Emery." My father set down his own napkin, folding it once, carefully, the way I'd watched him fold things his entire life whenever he needed his hands to do something steady while the rest of him wasn't. "No," he said, "I think it's exactly as simple as it looks." If you've ever watched two people's carefully built story collapse in real time, in front of the exact family they'd spent months exploiting, comment the word collapse, because I have never seen anything land quite that heavily in a single room before or since. And subscribe because the legal and financial reckoning that followed over the next 6 weeks is the part of this story where I finally understood what real consequence. My father called his attorney that same night, before the last guest had even left the house. And within the week, formal reports were filed both with the Savannah Police Department and with Georgia's Insurance Fraud Unit. Since the original Fairhaven necklace had, in fact, been formally scheduled on our family's insurance policy at full appraised value, which meant its unauthorized replacement constituted insurance fraud on top of theft. Roman's formal identification report, alongside my own documented measurements and Sal's dated service records, gave investigators exactly the kind of clean, methodical paper trail that turns a family's suspicion into an actual prosecutable case, rather than a private argument nobody outside that dining room would ever believe. The detective assigned to the case, a measured, unhurried woman named Detective Priscilla Okoye out of the Savannah Chatham Metro Police Financial Crimes Unit, told me during our first formal interview that cases like this one almost never reach her desk with this much documentation already assembled. Most families, she said, sitting across a small metal table with a legal pad she barely needed to use, arrive angry and empty-handed, certain something is wrong but unable to prove it in any way a prosecutor could actually use. And by the time enough proof accumulates naturally, the person responsible has usually already moved 3 cities down the road under a new name entirely. She looked through my original appraisal photographs, Sal's dated service log, the bank's access records, and told me plainly, closing the folder with something close to genuine respect in her voice, that I had built without ever intending to most of the case file she would otherwise have needed months to assemble herself. If you've ever done the quiet, unglamorous work of documentation so thoroughly that it ends up doing the heavy lifting for professionals whose actual job it is, comment the word diligence, because I promise you, that particular kind of preparation rarely feels like enough while you're doing it, and it is almost always more than enough once it matters. Julian Voss, facing the combined weight of the Georgia investigation and a reopened inquiry into the Grantham estate matter in Louisiana, agreed within 3 weeks to a cooperation deal with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, and in doing so, gave investigators the name and location of the private buyer who had purchased the real Fairhaven sapphire 6 months earlier, a discreet collector in Miami who, once contacted by law enforcement with clear provenance documentation from my own original appraisal, agreed to surrender the stone rather than face a civil suit over stolen property he claimed, with at least some credibility, he hadn't known was stolen at the time of purchase. Detective Okoye called me herself the afternoon the stone arrived back in Savannah, before it had even been formally logged into evidence, and asked whether I wanted to be the one to confirm its authenticity for the record, an honor I understood from her tone that she was extending deliberately rather than as pure procedure. I drove to the evidence processing office that same afternoon, my mother's loop in my coat pocket the way it had been every day since October, and sat at a metal table under fluorescent light far less flattering than any lamp in my mother's sitting room, turning the stone slowly until the light caught it exactly right. The asymmetric hallmark was there, worn soft with age in exactly the way 113 years of real wear leaves a mark, nothing like the crisp, laser-clean precision of the copy. I sat with that stone for a long moment before I finally said, out loud, to a room of officers who had no idea what the moment actually meant to me, that it was genuine. The real necklace, missing the platinum collar it had worn for over a century, since that portion had already been melted down and resold separately for its metal value alone, came back to our family in December, the center stone intact, authenticated by my own hand under my mother's loop, the same tiny asymmetric hallmark catching the light exactly where it belonged. Roman helped me source a jeweler skilled enough to reset the recovered sapphire into a new platinum collar built, at my father's specific request, to the exact original 1911 specifications. A restoration rather than a replacement, the distinction mattering enormously to both of us by then. Roman insisted on being present for the final setting himself, standing over the bench like a man supervising surgery, and when the jeweler finally seated the stone into its new collar and held it up to the light, Roman looked at me instead of the necklace and said only, Vivienne, whose real legal name investigators eventually confirmed as Denise Kowalski, was charged with theft by deception and insurance fraud. And given the documented pattern connecting her to the unresolved Grantham matter in Louisiana, prosecutors in both states began coordinating on the broader case. The marriage was annulled within the month, a straightforward matter once fraud in its inducement had been so thoroughly documented. She did not go to prison immediately, out on bond as the case moved through pretrial proceedings. But the legal exposure she now carries, across 2 states, is real, is permanent on her record regardless of eventual outcome, and follows a woman who spent years building an identity specifically designed to never be followed by anything at all. I reached out to foster Grantham's family in New Orleans myself, once the Louisiana case reopened, a phone call I hadn't been required to make and made anyway, because I understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what it felt like to spend years quietly certain something had been taken and unable to prove it. His daughter, a woman close to my own age named Corinne Grantham, cried on the phone when I told her what we'd found, not from grief exactly, she said, but from the specific relief of finally being believed after years of relatives gently suggesting she'd simply misplaced her own mother's bracelet. Our 2 families' cases, filed a continent apart from each other in ordinary circumstance, are now moving through the courts together, each one lending the other exactly the corroborating weight neither could have carried entirely alone. If you've ever watched real consequences finally arrive for someone who'd spent years believing consequences were only ever something that happened to other people, comment the word consequence, because I promise you, watching that machinery finally engage is a very particular kind of relief. And subscribe because there's one more piece of this story I haven't told you yet, the part where I finally let myself feel any of it. I did not cry at that dinner table, and I did not cry through the 6 weeks of depositions and insurance interviews and Roman's patient, steady presence beside me through every one of them. It caught up with me on a Tuesday evening in late November, sitting alone in my mother's old sitting room on Jones Street, the recovered sapphire laid out on a soft cloth in front of me, my mother's loupe pressed to my eye exactly the way she'd taught me 4 years earlier, verifying one final time that this stone, this exact stone, was truly hers. Something about being alone in that room, doing the one thing she'd trained me my whole adult life to do, finally let the entire year come loose at once. I cried for a long while, not for Vivienne, not even entirely for the necklace, but for my mother, and for the specific, aching fact that it had taken a stranger's theft to bring me back into this room to use the skill she'd loved teaching me most. My father found me there an hour later, having come looking when I didn't answer a text. And instead of saying anything, he simply sat down across from me the way he used to when I was small, and he apologized plainly for not looking closely enough, for letting loneliness talk him out of the instincts that should have protected this family sooner. I told him what I've come to believe completely true: loneliness doesn't make a person foolish. It makes a person hopeful, and hope is exactly what people like Denise Kowalski are trained to exploit. He held that sentence for a long time before he nodded. I want to tell you about mercy because it belongs here at the very end, exactly where it belongs. Once the real consequences had already landed, once the charges were filed and the necklace recovered and Denise Kowalski's carefully built identity had permanently and publicly unraveled, I made one choice that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the woman who taught me to look this close. Detective Akoy shared with me, carefully off the record, what investigators had pieced together about Denise's early life once her real identity finally surfaced. She had grown up outside Biloxi, raised largely by a mother who had run a smaller, cruder version of the exact same scheme for most of Denise's childhood, moving town to town, boyfriend to boyfriend, teaching her daughter, deliberately, the particular choreography of making yourself indispensable to a lonely man just long enough to take something valuable and disappear before anyone thought to ask hard questions. It was, Detective Akoy said, less a single bad choice than an entire inherited trade, the same way my own mother had passed down a loop and a decade of Tuesday afternoons, except passed down toward exactly the opposite purpose. I chose not to share those details publicly, not because they excuse a single thing she did to my family or to the Granthams before us, but because I decided, sitting in my mother's sitting room with her loop still warm in my palm, that exposing the truth of what Denise had done was justice. Exposing the wound underneath it to a public that would only ever use it for entertainment was not mine to give away. It's January now, 3 months since that birthday dinner. The Fairhaven necklace sits in a new safe deposit box, one with an access log I check myself now, twice a year, the same careful ritual my mother once performed and I once thought was simply sentiment rather than vigilance. My father has slowed down considerably on the dating circuit, not from bitterness, he tells me, but from a genuine, hard-won patience he never had to practice before. Marisla still serves Sunday dinner at that same mahogany table, just the two of us most weeks now, and my mother's loop hangs on a small hook by my own front door, the way the Fairhaven necklace itself once hung, quite literally in trust, waiting for whoever comes next to learn how to truly look. Here is the one thing I know now that a decade of training under my mother's careful attention never fully taught me until this past October. A fake is never actually built to fool the object it's copying. It's built to fool the people too tired, too trusting, or too grieving to look closely enough to notice the difference. My mother spent a decade of Tuesday afternoons teaching me to see past exactly that kind of tiredness, in stones, and it turns out in people too. And it took losing her completely to finally understand that the sharpest tool she ever gave me wasn't the loop at all. It was the patience to keep looking, calmly, methodically, long after everyone else in the room had already decided they'd seen enough. That's my story. One loop, one hallmark a fraction of a millimeter off, and a family that finally had to look closely enough to see exactly who had been sitting at our table the whole time. If someone has ever asked you to simply trust the surface of something instead of examining it closely, comment the word clarity below, and take this as your reminder that looking closely was never rude. It was always love, wearing patience as its disguise. Share this with someone who's been taught to doubt their own good instincts. Drop your own story in the comments, and I'll see you.